It's great to be here with you tonight, and that's how we say hello here at Texas A&M. My name's John Sherman, class of 92. I'm the Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening as we're getting ready to talk about the 35th anniversary of the U.S. liberation of Panama. Now, before I turn it over to my colleagues here, I first want to thank Andrew Natsios and his entire team at the Scowcroft Institute for putting this event together. Quick background, I started on 1 August, and when I got here, being a historian as well, I asked, had we done anything to look back at Panama, given it was President George H.W. Bush's first major commitment of military action in his presidency. And of course, we talk a lot about Desert Shield and Desert Storm, but one could argue that Panama was so consequential, not only regionally, but also because of President Bush's decision to do this, and indeed the confidence that it would give our military and the joint force that they would conduct months later in Iraq and Kuwait. And so tonight, we're going to look back on this 35th anniversary with some amazing speakers and panelists as we sit back and comprehend what the effects are all these years later. So thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you to our distinguished panelists and speakers. And Andrew, thank you again to Monica and the entire team and Cassandra and everybody for putting this together. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Natsios, and we're in for a great evening. Andrew, over to you, sir.
Good evening. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs here at the Bush School of Government, and I'm also a professor on the faculty. A couple of things. The ambassadors will pass out cards, so if any of you have questions, please write them on the cards. They will pass them to the aisle. The ambassadors will pick them up, and Professor Teague, who will be moderating the event, will go through them and use them to ask questions of our panelists. Ambassador, he's also a professor actually, Ambassador Luigi Einaudi is a distinguished American career diplomat. He had tours in the Secretary of State's Policy and Planning Staff, which is the intellectual think tank of the State Department, under both Republican and Democratic administrations. He had service as the U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, and later as the OAS's elected Assistant Secretary General. He was U.S. Special Envoy in the peace talks that settled the centuries-old territorial dispute between Ecuador and Peru. Born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1936, the ambassador earned his A.B. and Ph.D. degrees at Harvard and has taught at Harvard, Wesleyan, UCLA, Georgetown, and the National Defense University. I might add, I'm from Massachusetts. I found out not only is he from Massachusetts, but his wife, his delightful wife, is from Stoneham, and you're from Cambridge. I'll forgive you for being from Cambridge. But we're so pleased to have both of them here this evening. He just came out with a book last year, which he's going to give me a copy of, and I'm looking forward to reading it. He divides his time between Washington, D.C. and Piedmont, Italy. He and his wife have 4 children and 10 grandchildren. He did tell me, is it your father or grandfather who was the president of Italy after the monarchy collapsed in World War II? Was grandfather. He was president of Italy for the 7 years following the collapse of the kings after the Second World War was over. So he comes from a very distinguished family, and we're very pleased to have him here. He was deeply involved in the diplomacy of leading up to and just after the intervention in Panama. Ambassador.
In the old days, when I was young, I could speak off the cuff. now that I'm struggling to stay alive, I read what I have to say. And I just want to say that I thank Professor Natsios for that introduction. Sometimes introductions like that make you feel that the best has happened and you might as well leave. I should say that putting together these remarks it's been a bit of adventure, and I'm really grateful to the Scowcroft Center for doing it, pushing me into doing it, and to you for coming to share that adventure. Shortly after midnight, on the morning of December 20, 1989, I got a call from Assistant Secretary of State Bernie Aronson instructing me to call up the Secretary General of the Organization of American States and tell him that U.S. paratroopers were on their way to invade Panama. So this is a story that has to begin with the uniqueness of Panama. Panama's independence from Colombia in 1903 was made possible by the U.S. Navy in return for a treaty that gave the United States rights, and I quote from that treaty, "in perpetuity as if sovereign," unquote, to a 10-mile strip of land that cut Panama in half. And when completed 10 years later, something the French had desperately tried to do and never been able to do, the canal united the oceans. It really was like the atomic bomb years later. It became the symbol of man's ability and woman's ability to control, have power over nature. U.S. citizens ran the canal, and the U.S. military was ordered to defend it as if it were the United States. 35,000 or more U.S. citizens lived, operated, and defended the canal. A few of them actually lived in the Republic of Panama. Most, however, lived in the predominantly white and English-speaking canal zone, which had its own bases, housing, shops, and schools, all administered as if part of the United States. In 1964, I was consulting in the canal zone on January 9, when Panamanian students attempting to raise a Panamanian flag outside the canal zone's Balboa High School were fired upon. The riots that happened after that were really quite amazing. They cost lives, they cost millions in damages. I had spent time in Panama before as a student leader, so I had student friends and was able to witness and participate in some of the discussions that happened immediately after that. It was not pleasant. And the canal had become really a symbol of colonialism and a festering sore, hurting the United States around the world. I remembered this when members of the new Carter administration, including Bob Pastor, who was a friend of Professor Mike, who will speak after me, asked me, even before they took office, to start drafting a policy review on Panama. I was already in the State Department as a member of the outgoing Secretary of State Kissinger's policy planning staff. And the Carter administration's policy review memorandum number 1 Prim 1, we called it in the jargon of the bureaucracy, was entitled simply Panama. And it outlined a basic framework. The canal would gradually transfer to Panama, but the United States would retain the right to guarantee its defense. The 1964 riots had in fact stimulated negotiations that had gone nowhere because of opposition in both countries. We didn't want to give the canal away, and they didn't want to let us defend it. A key obstacle was that neither side trusted the other to abide by any agreement. In the negotiations during the Carter period, the presidents of Panama's neighbors, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Colombia, all played a major role as go-betweens, giving Panama's president, Omar Torrijos, the confidence that he could trust us. What I remember most about meeting with Torrijos was that he took me into the bathroom and turned on the water faucets and then said, "This will make it harder to bug what we're saying." Now, I never figured out who he feared might be listening in, but the act fitted the moment. And when the treaties were finally completed in September 1977, they were signed at the OAS with all of the hemisphere's heads of state present as witnesses. Everyone believed that that multilateral benediction would increase the likelihood of compliance by all countries, big and small. The U.S. Senate ratified them with 1 vote to spare. And when they came into force in Panama, Panama took immediate control of 2/3 of the former canal zone, with the rest evenly split between the Panama Canal Commission and the U.S. military, pending a transfer 20 years down the road. Now, democracy was not explicitly part of the treaty negotiations. General Torrijos had come to power as a result of a 1968 coup, but his personal charisma and progressive policies had made him widely popular. But Torrijos died in a mysterious bad weather plane crash in 1981. After his death, his intelligence chief, Lieutenant Colonel Manuel Noriega, gradually outmaneuvered all rivals. By 1983, Noriega was the real power, keeping a civilian figurehead as president, but running things as head of a new and more militarized Panama Defense Forces, which I'll refer to henceforth as PDF. Noriega soon had a finger in everything, from drug trafficking to money laundering, ultimately expanding into clandestine political operations of all colors, including the sale of restricted U.S. technology to Cuba. And all the while, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Drug Enforcement Administration were all paying him for his services, along with many others. But it was politics that finally undid Noriega. In 1987, he broke a secret pact with fellow officers and assumed sole control of the PDF. Those same fellow officers immediately accused him of murder and other crimes, so Noriega built up his intelligence forces, loyal units, and unofficial paramilitary gangs. His civilian opponents also organized. The Cruzada Cívica Nacional, I remember very well, with all kinds of I even looked for some of their mementos and couldn't find them. I'm shrinking in many ways. And they developed strong business and political ties to the United States. Then in February 1988, federal grand juries in both Tampa and Miami returned indictments against Noriega for drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. In defense, Noriega wrapped himself in the Panamanian flag, denounced Yankee imperialism, and began a campaign of harassment against U.S. personnel. The U.S. responses on the ground were marked by differences and contradictions, disagreements among the different U.S. agencies involved. The Panama Canal Commission, which was responsible for the canal. The embassy, which was responsible for relations with Panama. The military, whose Southern Command was responsible for operations in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as defense of the canal. The Drug Enforcement Administration, which was running the drug war. And of course, the CIA, responsible for both covert and national action and intelligence. The DEA and Noriega's CIA handlers felt Noriega was a national intelligence asset of the United States. The State Department fairly typically tried to cover all bases, but became increasingly hostile to Noriega, and after 1987 began to look for ways to remove him from office. The commander of U.S. forces in Panama, General Fred Werner, felt Noriega was a thug, but sought to avoid confrontations that would further politicize the PDF and put U.S. citizens in Panama at risk. Such differences are normal. Many different agencies have a hand in the U.S. foreign policy pie, and with a lot of institutional self-interests. A key function of the National Security Council, which I'll refer to from now on as the NSC, is to protect the president and serve our country by forcing government agencies to set forth honest and workable options so that good decisions can be made. Unfortunately, during the Reagan years, the Central American wars and Iran-Contra greatly weakened interagency communication and coordination. The IG, the Interdepartmental Group for Inter-American Affairs, was replaced by the RIG, a restricted group of 3 individuals who didn't share their deliberations even within their own agencies. Internal tensions over Panama became acute, but were not resolved. As frustrations rose, General Werner made a speech in February of 1989, lamenting that no Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs had yet been named by the incoming George H.W. Bush administration. This, he said, was proof of, and I quote his unfortunate choice of words, a policy vacuum in Washington, unquote. Werner did not understand Washington as well as he understood Latin America. When he said in February that the Bush administration was still getting organized, he was correct, but only formally. President Bush was no newbie. He'd already named his friend and campaign manager, Jim Baker, as Secretary of State, and had made General Brent Scowcroft his national security advisor to run the NSC. Bush and Baker understood the politics, Scowcroft the bureaucracy. I first met General Scowcroft when he was a lieutenant colonel assigned to the Pentagon. He was utterly unpretentious, had the great gift of knowing how to listen, and was extraordinarily efficient. The Scowcroft model, which is what we called it, of the NSC, had the NSC at its best when it ensured that the recommendations that actually reached the president were fully staffed and, in particular, scrubbed of special interests. Rather than the policy vacuum Werner had described, the interagency system was coming back to life as the Bush administration prepared to dig its way out of the dead end into which the Reagan administration had fallen in Central America. The days of freelancing amidst government paralysis were over. In Panama, hopes were focused on the presidential elections to be held May 7. But when it became obvious the opposition was winning, Noriega stopped the counting, despite the presence of numerous observers, including former President Carter and a bipartisan group of U.S. congressmen. Panama's Catholic bishops broke their traditional pastoral silence and declared their tallies showed the opposition had a 3-to-1 advantage over Noriega's candidate. When protesters marched the next day, pro-Noriega gangs attacked and bloodied them. If we could show the one slide, please. Well, there you have it. Many of you were not yet born then. The internet was just beginning, and Americans still got their news from just a few sources. And one of them was Time magazine. And that photograph is, in a sense, the origin of Just Cause in terms of American politics. That photo shows Panama's winning vice presidential candidate, Billy Ford, covered with the blood of his bodyguard, murdered by a thug from one of Noriega's paramilitary dignity battalions, and with another paramilitary guy getting ready to take a swing at him. President Bush recalled, I think we can take that down, it's pretty, I must say that was burned itself in my memory, and I didn't need to dredge it up to try to remember it. President Bush recalled the U.S. ambassador and sent in some 2,000 fresh troops to the Canal Zone. Now, Venezuela convened an OAS meeting of foreign ministers that agreed to send a mission to Panama, quote, to urgently promote compromise formulas to ensure transfer of power, unquote. But the negotiations dragged on inconclusively, recalling U.S. efforts that we had made the year before to try to negotiate Noriega out of office. And President Reagan had at that point agreed to drop the indictments against Noriega in return for Noriega leaving office and going into exile in Spain. Reagan said, quote, this deal is better than going in and counting our dead, unquote. Noriega had seemed to accept the deal, but he reneged at the last minute. And part of the reason I heard in those days was because his own officers felt that if he left, they would be in trouble. And so they didn't want him to leave. The result was an increasingly tense game of tit for tat between U.S. personnel hoping to stimulate resistance to Noriega and Noriega supporters protesting the U.S. presence. Like General Werner, the commanders of USARSO, U.S. Army South, the U.S. Army component in Panama, Generals Bernie Lufke, and then, after Bernie, Mark Cisneros, were Spanish speakers, sensitive to local complexities. They felt, like Werner, that there were too many U.S. citizens sprinkled around Panama in too many places to protect in case of a breakout of violence, let alone a surgical U.S. strike to take out and kidnap Noriega. Werner, the Southcom commander, began to be called WIMPCOM behind his back. And Noriega became confident that we were paralyzed and that he could do whatever he wanted without our doing anything more than complain. On October 1st of 1989, Werner was replaced by Maxwell Thurman. Thurman was a friend of Colin Powell, who took over as chairman of the JCS the same day. On October 3, while Thurman and Powell were still settling into their offices, or as we used to say, finding their way to the bathroom, an associate of Noriega, PDF Lieutenant Colonel Moises Giraldi, captured Noriega in an attempted coup. Unsure about Giraldi and fearing a trap, the U.S. stood by to see what would happen. Noriega loyalists talked Giraldi into surrendering. Noriega had him executed that afternoon. Some critics have argued that by not supporting Giraldi, the U.S. lost a major chance to help Panamanians remove Noriega without having to resort to force ourselves. But the speed and effectiveness with which PDF forces rallied behind Noriega led others to conclude that for Noriega to be forced out, the PDF itself would have to be destroyed. Thurman was a military planner who knew Washington, and he decided that Werner's contingency planning and rules of engagement were too soft on the PDF. And to respond to the preoccupation that it would be impossible to provide for the safety of American citizens spread all over Panama if the PDF was given time to act in a crisis, Thurman asked his staff to plan for actions that would immediately engage every PDF unit and seize all its installations, plus the 28 residences known to be frequented by Noriega, who kept on the move to preclude a surgical strike against him. That fall, while those plans were still being developed, and I was still in limbo awaiting Senate confirmation as ambassador to the OAS, I attended a conference of regional mill group commanders at General Thurman's invitation. In the middle of the night, a smoke bomb in the lobby of the Hotel Intercontinental set off a fire alarm. And as we stood in the street at 2 a.m. in various states of undress, my friend Colonel J. Cope commented that this was typical of Noriega's harassment. 2 months later, a U.S. officer was shot in the back and killed in Panama City, and an officer who had witnessed the shooting was arrested and his wife abused. Noriega and his people had gone too far. Colin Powell presented Thurman's plan, which now drew on forces stationed in the U.S. as well as Panama, to the president. Scowcroft played devil's advocate to consider alternatives and weaknesses. President Bush concluded, let's do it. Fearing that Noriega and the PDF would realize that a U.S. military action was coming and start taking hostages, the decision was very tightly held. Chargé Busnel was instructed not to inform members of the embassy staff. Those military personnel who needed to know were instructed not to inform their families. At Fort Amador in the Canal Zone, a PDF unit was stationed across the golf course from a military housing area. Without explaining what they were doing or why, U.S. soldiers began setting up machine guns and 105 millimeter howitzers in their own families' backyards, preparing to engage the PDF unit across the field. Some have argued that the U.S. always wanted to forcibly remove Noriega from power, but Operation Just Cause took place only after extraordinary efforts, first to negotiate his departure and then to induce the PDF to give him up. These efforts were multilateral as well as bilateral and were abandoned only after Noriega's harassment of U.S. personnel legally stationed in Panama and their families turned to murder. This said, our resort to military force brought out everyone's fears of U.S. imperialism. By the time the OAS Permanent Council convened an emergency session that same morning, President Bush had already been able to announce, and I quote, "Most organized resistance has been eliminated. Candidates elected by the people of Panama in the elections last May," unquote, "had taken office, and that," quote, "the United States intends to withdraw the forces newly deployed to Panama as quickly as possible," unquote. However, the president continued, quote, "The operation is not over yet. General Noriega is in hiding," unquote. Capturing Noriega had been the key immediate objective of Just Cause, but Noriega had disappeared. It turned out, and I'm reading from the official military history, during the night, one of Noriega's bodyguards surrendered to a group of U.S. soldiers and tried to tell them where his boss was located, only to discover that none in the group spoke Spanish. By the time the bodyguard was brought to General Cisneros' attention, the information was too old to be of value. My job at the OAS became that of trying to delay, as long as I possibly could, the resolution condemning our military intervention. We did not want to be condemned with Noriega still at large. The chairman of the Permanent Council was an oil man from Trinidad named Angus Khan. Speaking in private with that classic Caribbean style, Khan told me, "You did the right thing, but you had no right to do so," unquote. And this summed up both the politics and the law in a nutshell. Early the morning of December 22nd, 44 hours after the meeting had originally convened, and after 3 suspensions of debate, and after I had delivered an impassioned plea on behalf of Acting Secretary Eagleburger to recognize that we were restoring democracy in Panama, 20 countries voted for a resolution that did not mention democracy, but, and I quote, "profoundly regretted," unquote, the military intervention. I cast the only negative vote, secretly relieved that at least the United States' action had been profoundly regretted rather than condemned. Venezuela, again, which had convened the meeting of foreign ministers after the electoral fraud, abstained. Venezuela's ambassador explained that, and I quote her, "In our heart of hearts, we know we did not do enough to prevent this intervention, which was brought on by the behavior of the de facto authorities of Panama." Sometime later, the president of Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez, invited me for breakfast at his residence in Caracas. Would making the OAS more effective in advancing democracy help avoid future U.S. military interventions in the hemisphere, he asked. The key obstacles we agreed were 2, U.S. activism and Latin American doctrines about non-intervention. We agreed he would work on the South American presidents, and I would work on the United States and at the OAS. Pérez succeeded in getting the Andean Summit to call for amending the OAS Charter to require immediate collective suspension of diplomatic relations in case of a coup. Mexico immediately opposed any such action, citing their Estrada doctrine that no nation has the right to judge the politics of another. I worked behind the scenes to suggest that a coup should meet an automatic response, but only perhaps in the form of a meeting without a predetermined outcome. My hope was that this more modest position might be acceptable to supporters of non-intervention as a compromise. Brazil then proposed, quote, "sudden or irregular interruption," unquote, of democratic processes as a trigger, thus eliminating the word coup and thus avoiding ruffling military feathers so they wouldn't feel the resolution was aimed against them. And Brazil's move isolated Mexico, and it won the support of key Spanish-speaking states. But now, the Commonwealth Caribbean felt uninformed and left out. And after a tense negotiation, CARICOM came on board in return for our agreeing to develop, and I quote, a set of proposals that will serve as incentives to preserve and strengthen democratic systems. General Assembly Resolution 1080, representative democracy, instructed the Secretary General to call for the immediate convocation of the Permanent Council in case of any sudden or irregular interruption of a democratic order. The response was automatic, without delays or finger pointing. This was a historic breakthrough, and it was the direct result of a desire to avoid a repeat of the U.S. military action in Panama. For 10 years, Resolution 1080 was, in fact, the basis of regional efforts on behalf of democracy. Unfortunately, a package of positive measures was never developed. In fact, funds for the OAS shrank, even as the much ballyhooed Inter-American Democratic Charter was adopted in 2001. Today, multilateralism is much weakened, and even the definition of democracy is controversial. Times have changed. Okay, let me conclude. Operation Just Cause lasted 5 weeks, from December 20, 1989 to January 31, 1990. It was primarily an Army operation, but each of the military services was involved. Conventional units, such as the 82nd Airborne Division, the 7th Light Infantry Division, the 75th Ranger Battalion, and the Panama Base 193rd Infantry Brigade, were complemented by special operations forces from all the military services. Victory was so total that the PDF was destroyed as an organized military force in a few hours. 23 U.S. soldiers and 3 U.S. civilians died, with 324 wounded. This out of a force of more than 27,000, not to mention the thousands of U.S. civilians and dependents in Panama. Just 6 years earlier, Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada had revealed such poor coordination among the armed services that it led to major reforms in the Goldwater-Nichols Act. In contrast, Operation Just Cause was a model of multi-service cooperation with centralized command to project contingency forces, that is to say combinations of forces from bases in the United States to trouble spots overseas. Once Noriega was tried and convicted, Panama disappeared from public view in the United States. The Soviet Empire was disintegrating. Militarily, Washington priorities turned to the Gulf War and Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. For Panama, the consequences were more lasting. Several hundred PDF and pro-Noriega paramilitaries died, as probably did more than 1,000 civilians. A critical 3-hour battle at PDF headquarters destroyed the El Chorrillo neighborhood. By the end of the day, fires had consumed 15 or even 20 square blocks of low-income housing and slums, some of them made up of temporary buildings originally constructed 80 years before to house workers digging the canal. Some 10,000 Panamanians overwhelmed the refugee facilities set up at Balboa High School. As the shooting stopped, U.S. soldiers were surrounded by people asking for food, medical treatment, and the restoration of electric power and law and order. One officer asked, quote, "Where do we train an infantry or artillery battalion to run a city, take care of prisoner refugees, feed feed and police the populace and operate the public utilities. To deal with the widespread looting and turmoil caused by the destruction of the PDF, the decision was reached to replace the militarized PDF with a lightly armed National Police Force, the PNP. Senior PDF officers and some 40% of captains and lieutenants were released. The new police force was reduced in size from 16,000 to 12,000, most of them former PDF members partnered as a stopgap with some 2,000 U.S. MPs. Planning for what was called post-combat, quote, stability operations, unquote, had been compartmentalized even within the military. The State Department was excluded. After 2 years of tensions and sanctions, the U.S. ambassador had been withdrawn, assistance officers had left, and many positions were unfilled. The experienced Ambassador Dean Hinton, sent personally by President Bush to take over as ambassador, recalled that on arriving January 6, quote, I had no clue at all. Arrived here with a disorganized embassy staff, no U.S. aid at all, a few local employees, no resources, and a mandate to fix things. Hinton said he discovered that, quote, the Army was busy implementing a military government, unquote. Our diplomats had been informed that it would be against the law for diplomatic security, the State Department, to provide security overseas for anybody but State Department personnel. The Department of Justice had agreed to provide trainers, but AID needed time to find the necessary contractors. The human factor was also important. The outsider, Thurman, organized the military firepower to crush the PDF. Once the operation was underway, the insider, his USARSO commander, General Cisneros, manned the phones to PDF commanders in the interior, asking them to surrender peacefully. It seems that Thurman didn't trust the Spanish-speaking Texan. Military historian Lawrence Yates told in an interview, quote, it was two different mindsets. Thurman thought it was conventional warfare. He really didn't like that Cisneros was the guy who knew what was going on. Cisneros would talk about cultural awareness with his officers, while Thurman went around in military fatigues trying to impress everyone, unquote. To be fair, Thurman's knowledge of the outside was absolutely invaluable. It was he who knew how to find Spanish-speaking reservists serving in U.S. police forces to help the new PNP. And it was Thurman who identified about 1,000 Dodge Ram four-wheel drive pickup trucks in Germany, where they were pre-positioned in the strategic reserve for a NATO contingency. Unused, they were old and due to be replaced because of their age. Thurman got the Defense Department to declare them surplus and provide them to Panama's new PNP. There was a major resource problem. So long as combat operations were going on, joint operations with Panamanian police could be funded out of the Defense Department budget. But once Operation Just Cause ended in January, the Pentagon lawyers said the soldier police reservists needed to be withdrawn because joint operations would be against the law. To continue, assistance to the police required for foreign assistance or other special funding. Our national resource allocations go a long way to explaining this difficulty. For fiscal year 2024, the budget for the Department of Defense is $850 billion. The budget for the Department of State is $19 billion. That for the U.S. Agency for International Development is $43 billion. But the full answer is not just money. The better conclusion probably is yes, diplomacy and development need more funding, but we must also realize that most problems cannot be defined as purely military, purely economic, or purely political. Nation building, if it is to be tried at all, clearly is an all of government matter. It cannot be dealt with in cookie-cutter fashion or without full Scowcroft-like interagency coordination. In some cases, organizing local or multilateral support more effectively can do more with less. Unfortunately, our experiences in both Iraq and Afghanistan suggest most of these issues have yet to be resolved. Importantly, Panama was unique. No one believes that today's tragedy in Venezuela can be solved by a new Operation Just Cause. Fortunately, also, Panama has evolved into a functioning democracy with a free press and the alternation of political parties through competitive elections. Canal operations have never been disrupted. There are no U.S. bases in Panama. Panamanians today celebrate January 9 as Martyrs' Day in remembrance of the events of 1964 at Balboa High School that ultimately led to the Carter-Torrijos treaties. December 20, the date of Operation Just Cause, is ignored. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Some of that is not in the historical records, so I think it's very useful for us to publish your paper, as well for the other papers being read this evening. Thank you very much for your talk, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Eileen Teague. She is Assistant Professor in the Department of International Affairs. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. She's also a fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the Mosbacher Institute for Trade Economics and Public Policy. She earned her PhD in history from Vanderbilt University in 2018. She was born in the Canal Zone, not in Colon in Panama, the second largest city in the country, right? She traveled the world as part of a military family. I met her father and mother this evening, and served in the United States Marine Corps from 2006 to 2014. I have asked some of her students, and they said she does have a military bearing in class, which from our students would be a compliment, Eileen. She teaches classes on U.S. history and relations with Latin America and serves as faculty coordinator for the Latin America concentration. Eileen, you are the moderator, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Natsios, and also Dean Sherman for putting on this spectacular event, to Ambassador Arnadi for your insightful remarks, and to you all for joining us here in College Station tonight. And I also want to extend a welcome to those of you who are watching via Zoom. This December 20th, as Dean Sherman reminds us, marks 35 years since President Bush ordered 25,000 plus troops to Panama to depose and capture Manuel Noriega, the country's military dictator, who we learned a little bit about, in an operation dubbed Just Cause by the Pentagon to explain sort of its legitimacy. During Just Cause, U.S. troops entered Panama and captured Noriega, who would not cede power following elections. And as the ambassador recounted for us, Washington had a long and rather complicated relationship with Noriega, who had provided U.S. officials information on guerrilla activities during the Cold War and intel on many of the same crimes that Noriega himself would go on to commit, like drug trafficking and money laundering. The Bush administration had become opposed to his continued leadership and was concerned with the declining security situation around the Panama Canal. And President Bush cited 4 principal reasons for the invasion. We'll go through them real quick to kind of outline them before our esteemed panelists take the stage. The first was safeguarding American lives of the nearly 35,000 Americans living in Panama. The second was defending democracy and human rights. The third, combating drug trafficking, and the fourth was protecting the integrity of the treaties that President Jimmy Carter had signed with the Panamanian government in 1977, specifying the canal to be turned over to them in the year 2000. Panama had long been of strategic importance to U.S. security and our economy, and although it occurred in late 1989, it is widely considered one of the first U.S. interventions in the post-Cold War world. Yet some of the more interesting questions about the operation lie in its historical legacy, and that's why we are here tonight. Since the restoration of democracy on the Isthmus, Panamanians have elected 8 presidents from 3 political parties in free and fair elections. Panamanian democracy and control of the canal have flourished in the decades following Just Cause. And also, as the ambassador reminded us, and I think it's worth considering the complex legacy of the operation in Panamanian history, an episode that, put differently, has yet to be fully memorialized in Panama. And so tonight, we are concerned with how, as students of U.S. foreign policy and supporters of President Bush's legacy, we are concerned with how we remember. What lessons have we drawn from Operation Just Cause? And we have an esteemed group of experts to help us understand the impacts of this operation, segueing from the ambassador's remarks. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. And now, as someone who is writing a book on Panama, connecting to my roots, I know for a fact that one cannot study the country's modern history without encountering the works of Dr. Michael Conniff's research, and that's why we're so excited to have him here this evening. An emeritus professor of history at San Jose State University, Dr. Conniff earned degrees at UC Berkeley and Stanford and has published 10 books and many articles on modern Latin American history, most recently Modern Panama, published in 2019 with Cambridge University Press. He lectures in Portuguese and Spanish, and Dr. Conniff taught history at the University of New Mexico and later created Latin American Studies programs at Auburn and the University of South Florida. He also founded the Global Studies program at San Jose State University and its Global Studies Initiative. So without further ado, Dr. Conniff, we'd love to welcome you to the stage. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you for coming here and for inviting me. The Scowcroft Institute is a legacy that we should honor, to have the opportunity to go back over American foreign policy, American foreign relations, and study them so that we won't make mistakes in the future. So thank you for the invitation to be here. My remarks are dedicated to 2 fine men who passed away last year, historian Dick Millett, who was a specialist in Panama's history, and General Fred Werner, who Ambassador Ainaldi just mentioned. Those 2 men, if they should be here, but since they passed away, they're not here, they would have deepened our understanding of Just Cause. I'll focus on key decisions that led up to the invasion. I'll talk about some mistakes I believe occurred and omissions that happened, and I'll tease out some assessments of 35 years of hindsight on the events. I hope that I can reflect the views of Panamanian friends. I lived in Panama a number of years, and I let some of them know. So if you're on Zoom now, hola. First of all, I think we need to recognize, as Ambassador Ainaldi did, that we have to give credit to the Panamanians themselves who mobilized against General Noriega. It was called the Cruzada Cívica. It was made up of businessmen, students, professionals. There was an underground female movement led by a friend of ours, Brit Marie Perez. I think Orlando remembers Brit Marie. There were labor unions that helped carry out general strikes. So the Panamanians themselves had started a very strong resistance movement against Noriega in 1986, 1987, that we should always keep in mind. The Panamanians were not sitting back to wait for the United States to ride in on with the cavalry, but they were fighting very hard to get rid of the dictator themselves. They simply were not able to do it. The United States, in addition to all the things we've talked about, also imposed very strict economic sanctions on Panama, which actually shrank the GDP of Panama's economy about 20%, but it was not enough to get rid of the dictator. In the mid-1980s and late 1980s, as Ambassador Ainadi pointed out, the U.S. agencies were competing with one another as to what to do about General Noriega. For my reading, the Department of Defense and the CIA continued to rely on Noriega, as they had for a long time. But the State Department and the Drug Enforcement Agency had begun to shift and were now building up resistance to Noriega. So there was conflict at that agency level. The Reagan White House was increasingly uncomfortable, in fact embarrassed by Noriega, and especially when George H.W. Bush was chosen as candidate to be president in the 1988 election. Bush had been Noriega's handler as CIA, so there was sort of a secret relationship there that could be damaging to the future candidate. A major turning point, as Ambassador pointed out, was the Florida federal court indictments of Noriega in mid-1988, drug trafficking charges. And this was really a way for the U.S. government to say to Noriega, this is getting serious now. You're indicted, you're on the wanted list, and it was also an indirect invitation to any traitors to Noriega to step forward and take matters into their own hands, as happened several times, unfortunately not successfully. The White House was disturbed enough in 1988 to offer a deal to Noriega, millions of dollars and a safe passage to Spain. Two of my associates in Panama, Billy St. Malo and I think Mario Gronioni, flew up to Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1988 to help settle this deal to get Noriega to step down and exit the government. But by the time they got there, candidate Bush's campaign aides decided that they were not going to allow that deal to go through, the exit deal for money. And as George H.W. Bush said that same month, I will not negotiate with narco-traffickers on American soil or abroad. So that killed one opportunity to get rid of Noriega. Diplomacy came to a halt, and the invasion may have become inevitable at that point, although historians are careful not to say anything is inevitable because things do happen beyond our knowledge. With the failure of the exit deal and diplomacy, military plans ramped up in mid-1988, and there's an impressive array of code-named operations that I'm looking forward to Ben talking about. But as you read through the official history of how we build up to Just Cause, it's amazing how many operations are made and then changed and evolved. So it's quite a story. Thousands of fresh troops were moved down to the Canal Zone in preparation for trouble. The Southcom commander, Fred Werner, preferred diplomacy over war, saying it's Panama's problem. And he kind of slow walked the preparations under orders, and he proposed some very inventive approaches, but none of them were what actually happened in December of 1989, as we'll see. General Scowcroft became a national security advisor with the incoming Bush administration, and we're acknowledging Scowcroft's his legacy here. In mid-1989, Noriega, to save face, called on elections in May, and there was an opposition candidate, Guillermo Andara, and two vice presidential candidates, one of whom we saw in that picture. The election was held, and it was very clear, even before all the ballots were counted, that the opposition was going to win by a landslide. And so Noriega withdrew canceled the counting of the election, the ballots. He had failed to rig the election, and the election was canceled altogether. So it caused an international uproar, and that really was another very important turning point in world opinion against Noriega. By now, multiplying protests and crackdowns made President Bush appear to be weak. He couldn't control the man he'd once supervised as a CIA director. As Scowcroft put it, the administration had to find a way to respond to the whole wimp factor. In June of that year, 1989, President Bush decided to replace General Werner to get tougher on Noriega, and Admiral Crowe and Secretary Cheney recommended General Maxwell Thurman, who was at the end of his career and was ready for retirement. He had actually filed for retirement in 1989. Meanwhile, interagency deliberations had come to a point where they could advise President Bush as to what they recommended, and it was a set of policies regarding Panama and regarding Noriega that can be called, it's kind of synthesized as "Get Tougher on Noriega." Under it, President Bush had ordered actions to assert U.S. treaty rights. Noriega was hampering the rollout of the implementation of the treaty, protect U.S. citizens, restore democracy, and partly behind these actions was to keep Noriega and his supporters off guard, make them aware that they were in danger. U.S. Southern Command stepped up certain provocations, moving troops around and violating what the standing agreements with the PDF, spurring incidents that could eventually justify an invasion. Now, General Thurman was chosen to carry out the National Security Directive 17, the one that get tough on Noriega. He's largely remembered as author of the recruitment slogan, "Be all that you can be." So when you see that slogan, think of General Thurman. But he was also known for his no-nonsense command style. His colleagues nicknamed him Mad Max and Maxatola, because he didn't take any backtalk. In the fall of 1989, on the eve of his becoming head of Southcom in Panama, he oversaw a new rapid strike plan to shorten deployment from 5 days, which is what Werner had thought of, to 24 hours. And in those 24 hours, Thurman was going to catch Noriega. He was going to root out the PDF, the army, Panama's army, and take care of them in 24 hours. So it was really Thurman had this approach, which was game on, gung-ho, rock and roll, and that actually pretty much described what he did in Just Cause. Critics, however, remarked that under General Thurman, the operation could have been called Just Because we can kick serious butt. That is, forget the subtlety and just go in and carry out this military operations. So, in my metaphor is that Werner was going to approach Noriega with birdshot, and Thurman had both barrels blazing going into Panama. Another missed opportunity was what Ambassador Hinaldi said. Was Moises Hiraldi staged a coup in early October. He took Noriega prisoner. The White House didn't agree to take this handoff, and therefore Noriega's supporters managed to spring him to free him, and then over 30 of his attackers, Noriega's attackers, were executed. So it was a very, very serious breach that some people claimed that we really dropped the ball by not supporting these coup leaders. At this point, we're talking November, about a month before the invasion. The Berlin Wall was falling. The Soviet Union was beginning to disintegrate, and one of the other dynamics to keep in mind is that the National Security Council needed to shift its focus to Europe to take into account activities are going, all the very deep changes were taking place in Europe. And so that raised the urgency of having the United States rid itself of the problem of Manuel Noriega. Now there's another sort of turning point. In mid-December, Noriega was said to have declared war on the United States, and 2 days later we actually did set up the invasion. But I went back to our CIA listening post in Panama. They published a number of transcripts of radio programs and events that were taking place. And in fact, when Noriega supposedly declared war on the United States, he in fact told his legislative assembly the United States, through constant psychological and military harassment, has created a state of war in Panama. But immediately the White House and the press corps warped that into Noriega declared war on the United States, which wasn't really the case. The following night, a shootout with a U.S. patrol left a soldier dead, and that was really when the White House decided to go in. The decision in the White House was on December 17th, the airlift 2 days later on the 19th, and D-Day was the 20th of December. I call that the Christmas invasion because it happened 3 days before Christmas Eve. Now, the invasion itself was an overwhelming, massive, surgical, by-the-book military operation. But even so, it is controversial today. It certainly accomplished what General Thurman set out to do. But it's partly controversial because of the disproportionate force. We went in with 25,000 soldiers, all well-trained and well-equipped and so forth. And the Panamanians had maybe 4,000 or 5,000 defenders. So there was a disproportionate, there were about 6 times more invaders than there were defenders, and the losses were equally disproportionate. General Thurman assumed martial law, and he assumed he was a sole commander. He ignored the State Department for the most part. The ambassador was uninformed and was out of Panama at the time. We didn't have an ambassador in the embassy in Panama at that time. And General Thurman ignored the recovery, stabilization, and nation-building actions, things that we call civil military action. And the chargé, who was in the embassy at the time, John Bushnell, he helped save the military day from the U.S. standpoint by getting together the 3 men who had won the election in May, the previous May, and getting them to swear in as presidents and vice presidents of the new government. And he also elicited from them I think a sort of half-felt request for the United States to invade the country. The man who became president of Panama, Guillermo Endara, later said it was like a kick in the gut to know that these 16,000 soldiers were going to be landing the next day, and everything was out of their control. Now, regarding civil-military relations, that is, how do you stabilize the situation after you invade and after the action winds down? General Thurman said, "I did not spend even 5 minutes on blind logic," which was the plan for civil-military relations after the invasion. And early on D-Day, he told General Powell that no civil affairs units are available in the theater to support the mission of stabilization and recovery. And so it was only by the end of D-Day, after most of the action had taken place, that the civil-military plan began to take place. And it took actually months to implement fully the civil-military aftermath. And that's based partly on a very complete report by John Fishel, who was a civil-military officer on the scene at the day. There are other signs of disregard that Thurman had for outcomes, as he hadn't thought ahead what happens after we win. He had not foreseen the need for jeeps, but as Ambassador Ainaldi said, he did order in jeeps from Germany after the fact. There were no Spanish-speaking MPs available when he invaded, so they had to bring down several hundred Spanish-speaking National Guard officers from the American Southwest to help communicate with the people that they were taking control of. At a very huge cost, General Thurman ordered in 6 brand new stealth aircraft to attack an outlying airfield, Rio Hato, instead of the usual C-130s that they use for transporting paratroopers. So I think these are errors that we need to assign to the leadership. The Department of Defense and State Department were not speaking very much. They weren't really cooperating in this regard. But the tensions peaked after General Noriega resigned. But gradually, State Department began to prevail in planning for events in Panama, and so they took over from then on, and Ambassador Dean Hinton was sent down to try to restore civilian government in Panama as quickly as possible. What eventually became a really hugely successful peacetime transition, and I think Orlando Perez is going to talk about that. We need to credit several people in the State Department, Bushnell I mentioned, Dean Hinton, some civil military officers like John Fishel, and many others, and clever and talented Panamanians we need to recognize, like President Endara, Billy Ford, Arias Calderon, and all of their many associates who not only set up the new government, but also the new police force that came online. I think another outcome of a just cause was the formation of a cohort of policy experts we now call neocons, who, buoyed by the success of this operation, pushed for muscular foreign policy at the end of the Cold War. And as even President Bush said after Desert Storm, shortly afterward, by God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. The Vietnam syndrome being the reluctance to use military force overseas for getting in trouble and messing it up. So in some ways, Just Cause became a dress rehearsal for Desert Storm. I'd like very much a little essay written by historian Greg Grandin about 25 years after the 25th anniversary of the invasion. He noted how ignorance informed what the White House was doing with regard to Panama. Scowcroft admitted we were sort of the Keystone Cops. They didn't have any experts around in the White House to say, these are the people we can work with, these are the ways we should operate in Panama. They simply didn't have that. They simply had a simple goal, and that was to make Noriega go away with very few understandings of what their objectives, and exit strategy, and they were oblivious to collateral damages. Grandin concluded that paradoxically, as the Soviet Union's influence in its backyard, Eastern Europe, unraveled, it left Washington with more room to maneuver in its own backyard, Latin America. After Panama, Colin Powell announced what journalists called his doctrine for deciding on military intervention. Is it number one, is it vital national security interest threatened? Do we have a vital interest there that we need to protect? Do we have a clear and attainable objective? Have all the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? And I think for the most part, the Just Cause failed on all those counts. We didn't really take those steps, and I think General Powell came up with those conclusions after the experience. So I conclude that Just Cause was in a way echoed 1903 when the United States landed Marines to secure the independence of Panama in exchange for the treaty of that year that allowed us to build the Panama Canal. So we had really two U.S. invasions bracketed almost the whole century of American presence in Panama. The invasion for Panama's independence, get the Canal Treaty, and then the invasion of 1989 to secure the implementation of the last treaty. I think General Sherman was a lame duck, and I think he didn't have much supervision. I think he lacked diplomatic and political skills. In some ways, I think he was kind of a proverbial bull in a china shop. The way Teddy Roosevelt was portrayed as a bull in a china shop, he was caricatured that way in the early 1900s. I concluded in my book that Thurman was an overeager commander of an invasion of a small country under the heel of a dictator. Now, because of my familiarity with Panama, friends at the time asked me for my opinion about Just Cause, and I reluctantly said that Noriega was a monster of our creation and that only we had the power to remove him. So I said the United States had to act. But like this, with a devastating invasion instead of a Mossad-like extraction, definitely overkill, I believe, to nab one tin-horn dictator, as Reagan once referred to Torrijos. I'll never forget my historian friend in Panama in the mid-1980s during this cruzada civica against Noriega, fearing when his boy went out into the streets to protest Noriega. He said, my son sometimes came home bruised and bloody. We don't want a society like that. I have just two little afterthoughts. Time. Let me end there, and any other items come up in the Q&A. Thank you.
We are lucky that we were able to pull Major Ben Brewster out of the field to join us this evening. Major Brewster is an active duty infantry officer and a military historian with the U.S. Marine Corps. A veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He previously taught history at the Naval Academy. His master's is in history, focused on tactical decisions and errors during Operation Just Cause, and his doctoral research focused on civil military decision-making and national strategy development. Major Brewster.
Well, I'm sure that Eileen will keep me on track with time, but it's a pleasure to be here for Dean Sherman, Professor Natsios, and everyone else that was involved in putting this on. Thank you very much. So in looking at the front row here and trying to figure out what do I have to add, because I read all of your work to write my dissertation, the one thing I have to add is that I can read and that we have the archives right over there. And so I hope to offer some insights from the archives that may not have been available when you all conducted your research, gentlemen, and it's a real privilege for me to be able to explore it. And thanks to my chair, Professor Jason Parker, who's sitting back here in the audience. Thank you. President Bush made his first decision to send Americans to war on a Sunday afternoon in December 1989. He did so while taking a short break from the staff Christmas party at the White House, while the Pentagon's J3, the Director of Operation, Lieutenant General Tom Kelly, hastily briefed an ad hoc war cabinet along with the recent developments that occurred in Panama. In the room were also members of his cabinet and Andy Card, the president's administrative assistant. Andy recalled at the 2019 30th anniversary commemoration of Just Cause that occurred here, that as he juggled the easel, the map, and all the classified reports that were required for the brief, he noted that President Bush listened to General Kelly's intelligence update wearing his characteristically festive Christmas socks and a deadly serious demeanor. Less than 24 hours before, as you've heard here from our speakers, Noriega's PDF had killed Marine Lieutenant Robert Paz, tortured a Navy SEAL, and sexually assaulted his wife in El Chorrillo in Panama City. After some probing questions, Bush asked about response options, the likelihood of a military success, and card member Bush looked up and simply said, "Let's do it." The invasion kicked off 48 hours later. Operation Just Cause was rapid and decisive. U.S. troops achieved their initial objectives to capture and destroy all PDF garrisons in one day and cornered Noriega and the Papal Nuncio a week later. For Bush, Powell, the press, and the American people, it was a textbook military operation that gave them all much-needed confidence after 2 decades of military blunders since Vietnam. The U.S. military, particularly general officers in the Army, touted Just Cause as a tactically rapid and strategically decisive operation that would become the future model of American warfare. Their repeat success a year later in the sands of Kuwait seemed to verify this notion. The military then wrote and adopted several doctrinal concepts over a subsequent decade that focused exclusively on the supposed ability for rapid tactical action to produce strategically decisive results. Throughout the 1990s, journalists and historians overly focused on the tactical aspects of a day's worth of combat in Panama or the minutiae of Bush's decision-making process. His socks, for example. Consequently, academics began to speculate that Bush made an emotional or flippant decision to oust Noriega. Yet Bush, Scowcroft, and Powell knew the depths of preparation that led to such rapid and decisive success in Panama. As we will see this evening, the archival records reveal Bush's prudent plan for Panama. Overseeing just the military aspect of the operation had been General Thurman, as we've heard about already this evening, who had been handpicked by Secretary Cheney 6 months prior to the invasion, specifically to prepare to oust Noriega. And in turn, he selected a 3-star General Carl Steiner as his operational and joint task force commander. It was Steiner's staff who planned and brilliantly coordinated thousands of troops and hundreds of aircraft to simultaneously attack over 24 enemy objectives, all within an operational area similar in size to the city of Houston. More impressively, the majority of enemy troops were concentrated within the dense urban sprawl of Panama City, an area comparable to the size of the campus here at Texas A&M University. Such rapid and decisive success deserved to be understood and praised, especially in the wake of the military disasters since Vietnam, like the Mayaguez incident, the failed Iranian hostage rescue, and the Beirut barracks bombing. The press and army tried to make immediate sense of how Panama had gone so well so quickly. As it turns out, the journalists and soldiers proved to be the least reliable in recounting or making sense of the experience that they had been through. In the years immediately following the invasion, journalists flooded the market with tales of Noriega's moral and political corruption, making him an ideal villain for the heroic and technologically superior American soldier. And just over a decade later, around the time that Bush's son became president, a historical consensus began to emerge that alleged that Bush 41 had made an impulsive decision to remove Noriega to boost his domestic political image, or possibly as a trial run of the Powell Doctrine. Most interestingly, it is both that civilian scholars and military officers developed a post-invasion historiographical consensus that asserted a foreknowledge of an inevitable U.S. victory. They said after the fact, oh, we knew we were going to win before the fact. However, the last 35 years of historical evidence have shown that although tactically successful, the U.S. Army downplayed many problems amidst the afterglow of such a success. Some problems included excessive secrecy and planning, as you've heard about this evening, the confusion and disorder inherent in a night assault instead of a daytime operation, and many instances of friendly fire. Additionally, there was an absolute lack of post-conflict planning, which we're looking forward to hearing about after my remarks. So, what of Bush's prudent plan? Well, despite the general's claims, it was Bush, along with his NSC team, who had laid a protracted and strategic trap for Noriega at least 6 months prior, before tasking the military with planning to oust him. A week before the 1988 presidential election, the Panama Working Group, or PWG, in the Reagan White House drafted a message with a clear warning for Noriega. In a then top-secret memo from the PWG, then Vice President Bush laid out a 19-page overview of domestic politics within the U.S., current views about Panamanian politics within the White House, and options for U.S.-Panamanian relations moving forward without Noriega. The PWG memo speculated that Bush would win the White House, the Democrats would control Congress, which would mean a divided U.S. government, yet there was one topic that both political parties could agree on. Noriega had to go. Finally, in a classic and classy Bush move, this memo was voice recorded after being translated and hand-delivered to Noriega. Bush clearly had a strategy for Panama before he became president and communicated it effectively to Noriega, but he wasn't listening. After the inauguration in 1989, the NSC confirmed and pursued the policy outlined in this cassette tape. Although it is too long to chronicle this evening, the archives just across the courtyard here confirm that Bush's team doggedly pursued the same strategy throughout 1989 while still managing the rest of that pivotal year. President Bush and Brent Scowcroft implemented an additional and complementary strategy to force Noriega into public elections in May of 1989. As you saw, the picture and the media fiasco that resulted afterwards, in a declassified NSC Panama Security Directive, or SRD, that was declassified in 2014, it outlined several different methods to embarrass and isolate Noriega in the international media. Along with them were former President Jimmy Carter's U.S. observation team to identify and verify election fraud in Panama, which he did. Throughout the summer and fall, Bush and the NSC kept up the pressure on Noriega through economic sanctions and an influx of U.S. troops for exercises, in addition to private calls from President Bush to opposition leaders in Panama for the specific purpose of knowing that Noriega had their phone lines tapped and he would receive those messages as well. Pressure built until October, and the coup and the failed efforts that we've heard about here for want of U.S. support, and State Department cables and previously classified NSC meeting minutes show that by November, Bush began to socialize the idea of removing Noriega militarily. It is also remarkable to note, in a more global perspective, that following the fall of the Berlin Wall at the Malta Conference in the first week of December, Bush and Scowcroft brought up Panama and Noriega no less than 5 times with Gorbachev, although discreetly and in circuitous ways. The Russians' understated and seemingly knowing response were the same every time. Cuba was the only serious interest of Russia's in the Western Hemisphere. Noriega was on his own. In the years that immediately followed Just Cause, it appeared to journalists, soldiers, and historians who relied on their accounts that a rather predictable and logical chain of events led Bush to a rash overreaction to order military intervention. As the story goes, and as you've heard this evening, when a Marine officer was killed and a SEAL was beaten and his wife harassed, the gentleman at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue had finally had enough. As I've already shown this evening, the archives prove much more of a calculating president and prudent civilian oversight of the military. Yet for the military, this incomplete and teleological thinking about Operation Just Cause led to a decade full of misguided military concepts in the 1990s, which we do not have time to go into this evening, but among them were 1992's decisive force, 1996, rapid dominance, later known as shock and awe, and by the year 2000, the Clinton administration's final defense planning guidance stipulated that the U.S. Joint Forces Command would develop a strategy and a doctrine for operations to be conducted rapidly and decisively, which spawned the 2001 concept of effects-based operations and a 2002 concept for rapid, decisive operations. Neither of these concepts nor the operational thinking and planning cultures they created in the officer corps offered any tangible way to link tactical action to national objectives, as had been accomplished in Panama and in Kuwait. These concepts both amounted to a strategy of tactics and did not seriously consider the tremendous amount of coordination by civilian decision makers and staffers in the Bush White House that made Just Cause and Desert Storm and Desert Shield possible and effective. But those would be problems for Bush's son in the 2000s. Yet, in December 1992, at Bush's final Christmas party, his son couldn't have envisioned that future for himself or the nation. He was simply a guest at his father's last Christmas party in the White House. The staff surprised Bush 41 with his Saturday Night Live spoof character, Dana Carvey. It's great. If you look it up on YouTube, it's a phenomenal clip. Dana Carvey offered a stirring tribute to Bush's character and poise. He even included a few well-timed Bush mimics of the word that had come to define his presidency the most, prudence. And I'm not going to attempt to do the voiceover here. Yet that prudence did not mask timidity or indecision, but rather revealed wisdom, time, and again, everyone in the room knew this to be true. Many had advised him as he made world-changing decisions since the first Christmas in the White House. They had watched his calculated and understated response to not dance on the wall when it came down in Berlin. They listened to him negotiate the end of the deadliest standoff in world history. They had experienced the pressure as he navigated German reunification, and they watched him consider the cost of committing military forces to check aggression in this hemisphere and the other. And they helped him oversee 2 very effective military operations. Still others in the midst of that festive Christmas gathering knew the depths of his wisdom in seeking a balanced budget, his vision in championing the Disability Act, voting reform, and the Clear Air Act. Carvey relayed to the crowd that he was often asked how he could mimic Bush so well. He said it was simple. First, you take Mr. Rogers, then you add a little John Wayne, and you've got George Herbert Walker Bush. The room roared with applause and laughter, not for the comedian, but for the quintessential American gentleman in their midst, who they all knew was bidding them a farewell as a one-term president. He was the last of a World War II generation to lead the nation. Those who had been with him 3 Christmases before at a similar Christmas party would have recalled that his legacy as a commander-in-chief began when he made a prudent decision to send the army to Panama. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Orlando Perez, a professor of political science at the University of North Texas at Dallas, where he also served as dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. As a consultant, he has worked on public opinion surveys, democratization, anti-corruption issues for USAID and UN Development Program. He's written extensively on post-invasion Panama and works including Making Police Reform Matter in Latin America. Dr. Perez, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Teague, and thank you, Director Natsios and Dean Sherman, and to all of you for joining us this evening. My focus is going to be almost exclusively on post-invasion Panama and on Panama itself. And the question that animates my presentation today is, can democracy emerge from a military invasion by an extraterritorial power? Answers to this question vary from those who argue that democracy can only be built indigenously through a nation's own cultural patterns, to those who argue that traumatic events such as war, an invasion, can break old norms and allow new values to develop that are more conducive to democracy. Russell Crandall, in a study of the effects of intervention in Grenada, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, argues that, quote, the historical record suggests that in all 3 outcomes, democratic institutions emerged stronger than before the interventions. A survey, on the other hand, by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, dedicated to U.S. involvement in military operations abroad in the 20th century, indicates that only rarely was democratization the result? No country in Latin America has been the subject of greater, more protracted international influence, and particularly U.S. influence, than Panama. If one observes several indices of democracy, empirical indices of democracy since the invasion, since 1989, such as Varieties of Democracy, Freedom House, Scores, Polity, etc., they all show that Panama has emerged as a stable electoral democracy. As Dr. Teague mentioned, one of the most successful in an otherwise unstable region. 7 elections with 7 peaceful transfers of power, high levels of political participation, an independent electoral tribunal that guarantees free and fair competition. While multiple problems remain, corruption, weak judicial institutions, and an economic model that perpetuates certain levels of inequality, rural versus urban, indigenous areas versus the transit zone, democracy in post-invasion Panama has in fact succeeded. And the question is why, all right? And my own work has focused on 6 factors which I think explain the success of democratization in Panama. Panama's political culture, demilitarization process, the transformation of the Partido Revolucionario Democrático, or Torrijos's party that he formed under the military regime, the process of dialogue and consensus building that developed after the invasion, and the success of the management of the Panama Canal. At least 4 of these 6 factors are directly related to the invasion. And I must add, I forgot to mention, a consensus on the prevailing economic model, which I think has facilitated electoral politics in Panama post-invasion. Panamanians exhibit a transactional political culture. Panama's elites are predominantly merchants. Doing business is a deeply ingrained custom. Deal-making, transacting for the purpose of advancing an agenda or one's economic or political interests, is a vital component of Panamanian culture. Elites in Panama developed a mode of behavior that emphasized pragmatism, opportunism, and tolerance, and primarily nonviolence. As long as their economic interests were advanced, ideology was less relevant. The crisis that preceded the U.S. invasion was one of the few periods in Panamanian history when elites could not transact their way out of problems. The comfortable relationship between the commercial elite and the National Guard that had secured the stability of the military regime since the Torrijos coup of 1968 and permitted, for example, the Torrijos-Carter treaties, gradually came to an end as Noriega expanded the reach of the military power during the 1980s after Torrijos' death in 1981. The military went from an intermediary organization capable of negotiating with all social classes to imposing their vision of Panama on all sectors of society. Noriega surrounded himself with a new class of both civilian and military entrepreneurs who increasingly forced the commercial elite to accept them as silent partners. As Steve Robb has argued, equally important was the fact that the officer corps was beginning to challenge the commercial elite for social status. The predominantly white rabiblancos, as they are called in Panama, elite, strongly resented the presence of the drug-tainted mestizo and colored nouveau riche in their exclusive urban neighborhoods. The growing animosity between Noriega and the United States freed the traditional commercial elites to oppose the regime without incurring the wrath of their northern benefactors. Since the U.S. military invasion of 1989, the transactional nature of Panama's political culture has contributed to democratization by promoting dialogue and compromise among political and economic elites. The process of dialogue that occurred in the early 1990s, many in the lead up to the elections of 1994 and 1999, and the constitutional changes that abolished the military brought all actors, political parties, civil society, the private sector, businesses, labor, to the negotiating table to agree on basic rules of the game for electoral contestation and on constitutional revisions. The UNDP, USAID, and the Catholic Church played a significant part in mediating that dialogue, or that series of dialogue. The meetings that sustained the process of dialogue enabled leaders to construct agreements for conducting elections and for developing policy responses to key national priorities, such as the management of the Panama Canal. The ability of Panama to successfully acquire control of the interoceanic waterway in 1999 focused the attention of political actors who understood that failure to successfully manage the waterway would represent national and international failure for the country. Amnesties and pardons issued by President Endara and President Perez Valladares, and the report of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission authorized by President Mireya Moscoso essentially settled, these were the first 3 presidents in the post-invasion period, essentially settled most of the outstanding cases of alleged human rights abuses during the military regime. While not everyone was satisfied with the results, pragmatism prevailed in the handling of grievances from the military dictatorship as well as the U.S. invasion. Some in the PRD and ex-Dignity Battalion members wanted reparations for abuses during the U.S. invasion. In typical Panamanian pragmatism, the solution was to let bygones be bygones for both the invasion and the military regime. Eventually, Noriega himself and a handful of military officers did serve time in jail. Noriega died in Panamanian custody after being extradited from France on May 29, 2017, of complications from brain surgery to remove a tumor at age 83. Demilitarization and democratization are tightly linked. In fact, I don't think that you could have the latter, democratization, without the former. And the invasion made this possible. The alternative, a pacted transition or a PDF coup ousting Noriega, would have led to a mediated democracy where the military would have retained significant political power, thus weakening civilian authority, as it did in many other pacted transitions. The destruction of the Panamanian Defense Forces by the invasion, with all the trauma that it brought, particularly for supporters of the military regime, cleaned the slate for political transformation and allowed the post-invasion government to thoroughly change the civil-military relations structure. After the invasion, the Panamanian Defense Forces were dissolved, its command was transformed, and its personnel were the subject of a massive reorganization. From the ashes of the PDF emerged the Fuerza Pública, public force of 12,000 men and women modeled after Costa Rica's system. And here I'd like to give credit to Vice President Ricardo Arias Calderon, who as a Christian Democrat was close with the Christian Democrats in Costa Rica and essentially used the Costa Rican model to revise the PDF. The new public force was composed of 3 services: the National Police, the National Air Service, and the National Maritime Service. Since that time, the Air Service and the Maritime Services have now been merged. These units were almost completely demilitarized in terms of their structure, philosophy, weapons, and training. The new security forces were subordinated to civilian authorities through direct control by the Ministry of Government and Justice. Ricardo Arias Calderon was serving both as Vice President and Minister of Government and Justice, and budgetary oversight by the Office of the Comptroller General, as well as the Legislative Assembly. The other major process was the transformation of the PRD, the authoritarian successor party. And the PRD is probably among the most successful post-authoritarian successor party in the world. The party was formed by Torrijos in 1978 as a result of a process that he promised Jimmy Carter would be a process of liberalization, and he wanted the PRD to lead that process in sort of a pre-like state-associated party. In the post-invasion period, the party did something remarkable. It successfully embraced Torrijos while repudiating Noriega. The party claims the legacy of Torrijos. It claims itself to be Torrijista while playing within the democratic game. It has won the 1994, the 2004, and the 2019 elections. So 3 of the 7 elections have been won by the PRD. The institutional success of demilitarization in Panama is bound to the internal changes in the PRD. Without acceptance by the PRD hierarchy of the preeminence of civilian authority, along with the constitutional and institutional changes undertaken since December 1989, it is doubtful militarization would have been consolidated. The embrace of demilitarization was the result of internal structural changes within the party that purged the influence of former members of the PDF and their most ardent supporters, but more importantly, of a change in attitudes toward the role of the military within the state. The latter was perhaps more due to political convenience than real conviction, but was important nonetheless. The PRD accepted the new rules of the game and made no call or attempt to orchestrate disturbances or destabilize the reforms. The PRD was victorious, as I said, in the 1994 elections, and was clearly different from the party that had previously done little but rubber-stamped the policies of the military regime. Supporting the institutionalization of the demilitarization process allowed the PRD to consolidate its new credentials. The victory in the 1994 presidential elections vindicated this approach and demonstrated to party members that they did not need the support of the security forces to gain political power. And it's important to note here that not everybody in the Endara government or supporters of the Endara government wanted the PRD to be a legal party. There were many who advocated for a sort of a de-Baathification or a denazification process that made the PRD illegal and prohibited. I think, thankfully, Endara resisted those calls. Perhaps even more important was the peaceful transfer of power between the PRD and the Panameñista party of Mireya Moscoso, the widow of Arnulfo Arias, in 1999. An interesting characteristic of Panamanian electoral politics is that there are few viable options on the left of the political spectrum. The Communist Party, historically called the Partido del Pueblo, is no longer a legally recognized party because of its small membership and poor electoral results. The left has been represented in recent elections by some independent candidates and by an amalgamation of labor groups under the banner of the Frente Amplio para la Democracia. The FAD received less than 1% of the vote in the last 2 elections and has lost its legal standing. The weakness of the left is a result of Panama's economic structures. The preeminence of the transit economy has developed a near unanimous acceptance of neoliberal economic policies. Nearly every party, including the PRD, accepts the ideology associated with an open, free economy. In fact, it was a PRD-led government between 1994 and 1999 that implemented the harshest and most controversial neoliberal structural adjustment policies, including the privatization of major state industries. The left's weakness results in a rather narrow political spectrum. The major parties all tend to agree on the basic nature of the economic system and only differ on the emphasis of their sectoral appeal. Some are more rural, others focus on the urban middle classes, etc. This consensus has facilitated the conduct of elections because fundamental differences are small and anti-system forces too weak to be a real threat. Recent protests against the mining industry, for example, have sought to challenge this consensus, but they have yet to develop into a viable electoral force. In 2024, discontent was exploited by former President Ricardo Martinelli and his hand-picked presidential candidate, Jose Raul Mulino, who won the elections. And of course, Jose Raul Mulino is hardly an anti-system person. In fact, he's described his government as an entrepreneurial government of entrepreneurs. While Panama is certainly more than a canal, the interoceanic waterway has defined the country's existence since the 19th century. As such, the strategic culture of Panama has to be understood in terms of the political, social, economic, and cultural processes surrounding the management of the Panama Canal. Panama's economic development is intimately linked to the Panama Canal. The country was born because, as we've heard before, because of the dispute around which superpower would gain the right to build the interoceanic waterway. For Panama's elites, the building of the canal was the culmination of their dream to position the country at the heart of the global economic system. The evidence suggests that Panama's post-1999 management of the canal has been exemplary, despite the hand-wringing by many in Washington. The evidence suggests the canal has been profitable and has provided significant funds to the national treasury, and the management has been free of corruption. The Panama Canal Authority is consistently the most trusted national institution in the country. Demilitarization, the transformation of the PRD, the series of national dialogues, and consensus on the economic model have all contributed to the legitimacy of the Panama Canal's management. I suspect these processes might have been more difficult without the U.S. invasion. In conclusion, Panamanians view the invasion with somewhat mixed feelings. For some on the political and intellectual left, it was a violation of national sovereignty. However, most view it from a pragmatic perspective. As one former president told me, former president of Panama told me, quote, "The invasion was the successful execution of Noriega's arrest warrant. The U.S. came to get their man in Panama." Panamanians have made the best out of the opportunity the invasion provided to build a different political system and to regain sovereignty over their most precious asset. In the process, they have built one of the most stable democracies in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome our final panelist to take the stage, our very own Professor Andrew Natsios.
I had a role to play in this event myself, so I'm speaking from personal experience this evening. I actually was in the Army Reserves for 22 years as a civil affairs officer. So when they said there was no civil affairs officer, and when we invaded, there was one, me, but I wasn't on active duty, as a matter of fact. I was supposed to leave just after Christmas, day after Christmas. My wife, Elizabeth's here, long-suffering wife of 49 years. Why'd you have to leave the day after Christmas? I was supposed to go to Romania because Ceausescu and his wife had just been executed by the military, and the healthcare system had collapsed, and my office in AID was about to set up the system on an emergency basis. And there was no heating system, apparently, in Bucharest, so they said, wear warm clothing, there's no heat in the hotels. And I was about to leave for the airport, the White House call said, go back and get your tropical clothing, you're going to Panama. This is the photo order of the president. So I left with Fred Scheck, who was the acting head of the Latin America Bureau, a very well-known officer. Fred and I bonded on this trip, and I asked him to become my deputy when I became the administrator of USAID under 43. So Fred and I became good friends on this trip. We were supposed to fly in on our OFDA plane that we hid from OMB because we weren't supposed to own a plane. We owned a whole fleet of them that we kept through an NGO. We actually owned them, and that's allowed us to go over in these emergencies. OFDA is the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, the job of which is to deal with emergencies around the world. Civil wars, invasions, famines, earthquakes, and floods. And I was the director of the office as a political appointee. Fred was a career Foreign Service officer. Actually, he had had his MBA from Harvard Business School, interestingly enough. So we went, and they wouldn't let us land at Panama City. I remember that. The air traffic controller, who was a young sergeant in the Air Force, said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of OFDA from USAID." And they said, "What's that? You can't land." I said, we're about to run out of gas. We're going to have to land. And I said, if you don't want me to land, you need to call the president. What president? I said, President Bush, and tell him that you don't want us in the country. Wait a minute, please. And he got off the phone, came back, and said, you can land. Just to correct a few things from this conversation, which I thought was intriguing this evening, the notion that there was no advanced planning is nonsense. General Thurman, I thought, was out of control. That I agree with you with. He had a detailed plan, which he presented to me thinking I had billions of dollars, which I did not have, for reconstruction. He spent 2 hours. Fred and I had to listen to this detailed plan for the reconstruction of Panama that cost $20 billion, which is preposterous. It's a little country of 2.5 million people. You couldn't possibly spend $20 billion if you wanted to. He made Fred and I listen to this long presentation. I kept falling asleep during the course of it. And at the end, he said, well, are you going to provide me the money? I said, number one, I don't have any money. Number two, when we do, we will be doing it with the State Department, not through the Defense Department. This is not your role. And then afterwards, I called up Larry Eagleberger, the Deputy Secretary of State's Chief of Staff, and I said, General Thurman is out of control. He is doing our stuff, and I don't know whether he's spending any money, but he shouldn't be because this is not his job. And Eagleberger, Chief of Staff, said, I'll tell the Secretary right now, and that's when they sent Dean Hinton down, apparently. We were in charge of taking care of the about 3,000, I think it was 2,700 people who were displaced because the El Chorrillo slum, that are a poor neighborhood, had burned down. Mostly wooden houses, wooden apartments in dilapidated condition, and the PDF headquarters was right next to that. And so the firefight between the two sides, it was very easy to have it go up in flames. There were 2,700 people displaced. My job around the world was to take care of internally displaced people, so this was nothing new for us. We set up, the U.S. military set the camp up, but they said, we don't want to run this place. So I think it was the 20th of January of 1990, OFDA took over the camp, and we contracted, I think, with the Chamber of Commerce, interestingly enough, which we almost never would do anywhere else, but they seemed very competent. They took over management, we paid for it, and we monitored it. And I went on the internet this past to see how we did, because I didn't actually remember, it's 35 years ago, how we did. And the GAO, IG reports were excellent in terms of how we managed this whole process. And we built housing for the 2,700 people who were displaced. The way we did it, we sent in a very famous humanitarian researcher. His name is Robert Gassoni. If any of you want to read about him, there's a book called The Good American by Robert Kaplan, the famous journalist. It's a 500-page biography of Grassoni's remarkable life. We called him up and had him come in and actually interview for a couple of hours each, 300 people who were displaced, said, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to build a new apartment complex here? Do you want individual houses built? And we ultimately decided to let them choose, each individually, what they want done. So some of them chose houses, some of them said, we don't want an apartment building right here, we want it somewhere else. And there were audits done that are on the internet, I just looked them up. And it went very well. I mean, we were complimented. We got all this done in 9 months, which is very unusual. By September, November. Most of the housing had been constructed according to the reports I read. I technically signed all the contracts, so I was in charge of managing this, even though I don't remember it all in detail. We had civil wars going on all over the world, and I had other things to worry about as well. The last thing I would say is Fred and I met with Vice President Ford. Fred knew him from before, and Paul Bell was the head of the OFDA office in Costa Rica, and he knew Ford apparently for 20 years and said, Andrew, you want to meet with him? I said, look, I'm not a diplomat, but I'd be glad to meet with them if you want me to. They had an elevated view of my importance in Washington, and so I just listened. I didn't make any commitments, but I just sat and listened. I think I have to, just in conclusion, say that the $20 billion price tag, I think, encouraged the Costa Ricans to think they're going to get a lot more money than they did. How Thurman thought Ross Perot was going to, he called Ross Perot and asked for $20 billion. And I said, why would Ross Perot give you $20 billion for reconstruction? And he went into detail over it. I thought it was very odd myself. In any case, there was a package proposed. It was a $1 billion package by President Bush. Congress appropriated $470 million. We already had other money set aside that didn't have to be appropriated. But I did some calculating. It was the largest aid program in the world. The largest up till that point was in Egypt, was $1 billion a year with 50 million people. We had $1 billion with 2.5 million people. So per capita, that's how we judge in AID how big the program. The program was enormous. It is not as much as the Panamanians wanted, but some of that expectation may be because Thurman was projecting a $20 billion program. In any case, that's a little bit of a vignette. It's not in the histories that we did any of this, but it's all available on the internet in our AID archives, which go back to the Marshall Plan. So I'm finished. Thank you.
So Ambassador Naudi and our panelists have explored just cause and its consequences from several very rich angles. Because of our time constraints this evening, we've decided to forego our moderated Q&A and instead invite you all on your way out to come up and shake hands with one or more of our speakers. And so in conclusion for that, please join me in a round of applause for all of our speakers this evening. Thank you for joining us.